At 5:32 a.m., Jasmine Crockett opened an email that seemed routine, until she realized the bill it outlined would quietly erase millions from the future of American leadership. By midday, the cameras were rolling, and she stood inside a packed congressional hearing, staring down Marjorie Taylor Greene, the bill's fiercest defender. This wasn't a debate about eligibility. It was a battle over whose stories were deemed worthy of leadership and whose were quietly erased. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but what she said made the room freeze. She exposed not policy, but strategy, disguised discrimination coded into law. So what did Jasmine say that made Congress go silent and America sit up and listen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At exactly 5:32 a.m., before Washington, D.C. had even begun to wake, a sharp vibration shook Jasmine Crockett's phone off the edge of her nightstand. The screen flashed with a familiar alert, one she had set to bypass silent mode. A new federal bill had been introduced. Eyes still heavy with sleep, Jasmine dragged herself from bed, wrapped in a robe, and opened her laptop in the dim light. The subject line glared at her with surgical coldness. Federal Integrity and Eligibility Reform Act introduced. Summary attached. She paused. The name was too polished, too neutral. In her experience, legislation that used words like integrity and reform often meant something else entirely. She opened the summary file. Her eyes scanned the bullet points. By the end of the third clause, her fingers stopped typing. She froze, completely still. The coffee machine across the room hissed into silence. In front of her was a bill that, on the surface, seemed standard, but each line was an execution order hidden in plain sight. Clause 1. All candidates for federal office must provide evidence of 10 consecutive years of uninterrupted federal income tax contributions. Clause 2. No candidate may have received any form of government assistance, including but not limited to food stamps, housing support, unemployment benefits, or Medicaid at any point in their life. Clause 3. Candidates must not have any criminal history whatsoever, including expunged charges, juvenile offenses, or dismissed cases. Jasmine exhaled slowly, but the air felt heavy in her lungs. She whispered to herself, "That's not eligibility. That's engineered exclusion." Her voice broke the stillness like glass cracking under pressure. Within minutes, she was fully dressed and storming into her Capitol Hill office. The sky outside was still pitch black. Inside, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered on as she barked at her team, "Pull me census data, race, gender, and public benefits received from 2010 to 2020. Cross-check it with IRS tax records and federal candidacy eligibility." She didn't raise her voice, but the urgency in her tone made the walls feel like they were closing in. Her staff scattered into motion like a military unit on red alert. As her researchers dug in, Jasmine stood in front of the whiteboard, marker in hand. In bold red ink, she wrote one word across the top: erasure. Then she underlined it twice. The data came in fast, but each number felt like a stab to the chest. 83% of Black women between the ages of 30 and 55 had grown up in households that received SNAP benefits or Section 8 housing support. Nearly half of them had relied on public assistance at some point in their adult lives. Under the proposed bill, over 90% of them would be automatically disqualified from running for federal office. And the contrast was stark. 42% of white candidates would still qualify. Only 9% of Black candidates would meet the criteria. Jasmine gripped the back of her chair as she stared at the screen. Her voice was low and firm. This bill wasn't written to stop corruption. It was written to stop people like me. She walked back to the whiteboard and drew a triangle. At each point, she labeled the 3 new conditions: taxes, no welfare, no record. Then she added a circle around it and wrote, privilege-only zone. "This isn't about fairness," she said to her team. "It's about rewriting the rules of entry so that only the children of wealth, uninterrupted income, and perfect records are allowed in." The room was silent. Then she added, "They don't need to ban Black people with language. They just ban the roads we've taken to get here." As the sun finally breached the horizon, casting golden light across the Capitol dome. Jasmine Crockett wasn't basking in its glow. She was already digging into the shadows. Back in her office, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of computers and the hurried keystrokes of a staffer named Miguel, who had been working nonstop since dawn. He looked up, pale, holding something in his hand like it was radioactive. "Representative," he said, voice tight, "we traced the metadata from the draft bill, and you're going to want to see this." Jasmine walked over, slowly, deliberately, like a soldier approaching a live bomb. Miguel turned the monitor. There it was in black and white. Project Eliminate. The file hadn't just come from anywhere. It was created, uploaded, and last modified on a secure drive in the legislative office of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. No code names, no euphemisms. Just the word eliminate, cold, unfiltered intent, sitting right in the open like it had nothing to fear. Jasmine's hand curled into a fist at her side, her knuckles whitening. She stared at the name on the screen as if it had insulted her mother to her face. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned in close and whispered, "They weren't trying to fix the system. They were trying to erase the people inside it." Across the room, her team exchanged glances, the mood turning from disbelief to something darker, controlled fury. "Print it," she ordered. "Print every single version, every note, every edit. I want a forensic trail from the first word to the last period." Miguel nodded, already hitting keys. Outside, morning traffic honked faintly, but inside, the war had already started. Jasmine didn't need a press conference, not yet. She needed the truth, and this file was a smoking gun. Just as the printer began spitting out the damning pages, another alert pinged Jasmine's inbox. It was from an encrypted address, no name, no traceable signature. The subject line read only, "Confirmation, internal intentions of drafting team." She clicked it open, her heart pounding. Inside was a message, short and lethal. "I was one of the staffers assigned to code the draft eligibility filters. The goal was always to suppress low-income and minority candidates, particularly black women. The language was designed to look neutral. The algorithm was not." Jasmine's eyes scanned every line, absorbing it like a wound absorbing salt. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was real. Someone inside had just confessed to weaponizing legislation with precision data. And now the evidence was in her hands. She printed the email and laid it beside the file draft. Together, they read like a blueprint for political genocide, one of opportunity, not blood. "They didn't just write a bill," she said, her voice shaking with control. "They engineered a purge, one that would disqualify entire communities by the metrics of their survival." Her staff stood frozen, watching the gravity settle like dust after an explosion. Jasmine reached into her drawer and pulled out a red pen. She circled the word eliminate on the file printout and wrote in the margin, "This is not reform. This is selection by exclusion." Then she looked up, eyes sharpened into blades. "And I'm going to expose every last piece of it." The emotional toll clung to the walls like static. No one spoke. No one needed to. They were no longer reacting. They were preparing. Jasmine straightened her shoulders and walked to the window. The city moved as if nothing had happened, as if democracy hadn't just been quietly poisoned on a congressional server. She whispered to the glass, not for herself, but for every girl who'd ever been told she was too loud, too poor, too black to lead. "If they think we'll let them delete us with a spreadsheet, they've chosen the wrong damn story." With damning evidence now in her possession, Jasmine Crockett prepared for the next war front. Not the courtroom, but the camera, where reputations are crafted and silence can be louder than law. It began, as many political ambushes do, in a crisp, air-conditioned Fox News studio bathed in red, white, and filtered approval. Marjorie Taylor Greene sat straight back beneath the chyron, fighting for integrity in Washington. Her tone was deceptively calm, but the venom behind her words seeped through like oil beneath polished marble. "This country was built by people who gave to it," she said, lips curling slightly. "And now we're supposed to be led by people who took from it?" The host nodded approvingly, barely concealing his satisfaction. Greene didn't pause. "Congress should be for contributors, Those who've worked, paid taxes, built businesses, not for individuals who've lived off handouts and expect us to call it resilience. The message wasn't coded. It didn't have to be. It was a grenade disguised as policy, a direct swipe at anyone whose story didn't start in comfort. She finished with a chilling line, delivered as if she were reading a bedtime story. It's time we stop pretending that dependency is a qualification for leadership. That quote ricocheted across media outlets within minutes. Clips exploded across Twitter and Facebook, accompanied by incendiary captions. MTG calls out the welfare class in Congress. Greene, no more victims in office. But for Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't just a headline. It was an invitation to war. 6 hours later, under the cool lights of MSNBC's DC studio, Jasmine sat alone in front of a matte black backdrop. There was no decorative flag, no soft piano music, just the red light of the camera, glowing like a signal flare. The anchor barely finished his introduction before Jasmine leaned forward and spoke with the calm precision of someone sharpening a blade. "When I was 9, she began, my mother came home from the night shift and walked me to the corner store with an EBT card. She didn't look ashamed. She looked tired. She looked like someone trying to survive a country that always demanded more than she had." She turned directly to the camera. No script, no notes, just fury dressed in poise. "I used food stamps. I ate from free lunch programs. And I am not ashamed of that. I am proud of the fact that I came from struggle and still chose to serve." Her voice deepened with purpose. What Representative Greene said isn't just cruel. It's a symptom of a government that wants to be run only by the untouched, the untested, the unscarred. She thinks paying taxes is the only proof of contribution. But what about the people who gave this country their labor, their loyalty, their lives, without ever seeing a return? She paused, let that question settle like a weight on the room. If my childhood on Snap disqualifies me, then we're not measuring worth. We're gatekeeping humanity. She continued without blinking, her voice now steely and unflinching. "Let's tell the truth," she said. "This isn't about integrity. It's about invisibility. Greene wants a Congress that looks like a gated community. No renters, no debt, no broken histories. Just sanitized success stories. But here's the problem with that. This country was not built by sanitized stories. It was built by people who fell, who got back up, and who learned how to govern with compassion because they had to survive first." In the studio, the anchor sat still, eyes wide, almost reverent. No cue cards, no commercials. Just Crockett, reshaping the narrative in real time. "And let me say this," she added, her voice softening, but not weakening. "If standing here as someone who once relied on help makes me unworthy in Marjorie Taylor Greene's America, then maybe America needs to re-examine what worthy really means." The camera lingered as she looked down briefly, then raised her eyes with unmistakable defiance. "I didn't inherit a platform. I built one. With truth, grit, and food stamps. And I will never apologize for that." Every line she spoke that night would be clipped, quoted, and carved into the week's headlines. But in that moment, before the applause, before the backlash, Jasmine Crockett sat calm, steady, and unbending, because she had just turned an insult into an indictment and a smear into a spotlight. And for the first time in a long time, millions of Americans who'd once felt erased saw a piece of themselves staring back through the screen, unapologetic, unfiltered, and absolutely unafraid. The lights of the studio had faded, but the fire Jasmine Crockett lit refused to die. Instead, it surged into the halls of Congress, demanding a stage that no committee could ignore. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., but by 6:30, people were already gathering on the Capitol lawn. Some held handmade signs, "We belong." Food stamps raised leaders too. Erase the bill, not the people. Others simply stood in silence, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the grand white building, as if waiting for it to blink. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Every hallway echoed with whispered predictions. Staffers scrambled, camera crews adjusted tripods, and aides distributed bottled water that no one drank. This wasn't just another policy review. This was the moment the country would be forced to look in the mirror. Jasmine Crockett entered the chamber with the gravity of someone walking into a courtroom where the verdict would be national memory. She wore black, not for mourning, but for clarity. Every line on her suit was sharp. No brooch, no flag pin. Her only accessory was a red folder clenched tightly in her left hand. In it, the leaked documents, the metadata, the anonymous email. But today wasn't about papers. It was about presence. She moved through the rows of lawmakers like a storm cloud passing over a dry plain, unavoidable, electric, and full of charge. Some glanced at her, others refused. A few looked like they were preparing to be dismantled. She took her seat. The microphones were already live. The nation was already watching. She didn't begin with greetings or formality. She looked directly into the lens of the center camera, her voice level, low and deliberate, each word calibrated like a drumbeat. "I am not here today for myself." She let it hang. The silence that followed was a silence no one dared fill. Then, "I am here for the ones you don't see. The ones whose names never make it onto ballots, not because they lack the will, but because systems were built to ensure they'd never qualify." Her voice remained calm, but there was iron beneath it. This bill was not written to promote fairness. It was written to enforce memory, one narrow, privileged version of who deserves to lead. She held up the bill, her fingers pressing the pages like a surgeon holding something diseased. 10 years of uninterrupted taxes, no history of assistance, no record, no matter how long ago or how unjust the charge. Let me be clear, these are not standards, these are weapons. This bill is a blueprint for selective citizenship, drawn not in ink, but in data points designed to erase. She placed the bill down, gently, not with rage, but with surgical precision. Then she leaned forward. "I grew up watching my mother carry 2 jobs and an EBT card. I grew up in a household that needed help, and received it. Not because we were lazy, not because we were broken, but because the country we loved told us that temporary need did not mean permanent disqualification." Her voice cracked just slightly, not from weakness, but from the immense weight of truth. She steadied herself. "If this bill had existed when I was a child, the version of me that stands before you today would have been locked out before I ever stepped in." Then she added slower, lower. "And that was the point, wasn't it?" A murmur rippled across the chamber. No one spoke to stop her. Even her critics sat frozen, unwilling to interrupt what they knew would echo far beyond the room. She raised her eyes again. "I testify today for those who are being legislated into silence. I speak for every child whose parents told them, one day, you could serve, and who now must watch a law try to render that dream impossible, not because they are incapable, but because they were inconvenient to someone else's vision of America." Her final line wasn't shouted. It was whispered with clarity so sharp it could have carved stone. "I'm not just testifying for myself. I'm testifying for the erased." And with that, she sat back, leaving not just her words, but their weight, hanging in the air like judgment. The chamber had gone quiet, not out of respect, but because something irreversible was beginning to stir, and Jasmine Crockett was at the center of it, unfolding a reckoning disguised as legislation. She held the printed bill with both hands, the pages no longer trembling, but firm, like a courtroom exhibit. Her voice was steady, clipped, and deliberate, as if she were chiseling the words into marble. "Let's not pretend this is just policy," she said. "Let's read it for what it truly is. A blueprint for exclusion disguised as a test of integrity." She lifted her eyes. "Clause 1, 10 consecutive years of federal tax contributions." She paused. "So let's talk about someone who wouldn't pass." She held the room with silence, then dropped the name. Barack Obama. The reaction wasn't vocal, but it rippled. An audible shift in posture, a sudden intake of breath. "Raised by a single mother," she continued, eyes narrowing, "who needed food stamps to keep the lights on. Under this law, he would not have met your standard." She moved forward with the bill still in her hands, like a witness carrying proof of a crime. Clause 2, no history of receiving public assistance. Ever. She let the weight of the word ever hang. "Doctor? Kenyatta Ross, she continued, first-generation college student, graduated Harvard Medical School, now a trauma surgeon who rebuilt her community hospital. She walked slowly across the chamber, eyes locked on the committee. She received Medicaid while studying and working overnight shifts to survive. This bill would erase her before she could ever run. She raised her voice just slightly, enough to slice through the hush. Not because she isn't intelligent, not because she isn't capable, but because she once said, "I need help." She stopped in front of her seat, bill at her side, and stared down its authors like a verdict. Then her tone dropped, tighter, colder. Clause 3, no criminal history, including expunged or dismissed records. She didn't blink. Sergeant Malik Jones, U.S. Army, 2 tours, Bronze Star, came back with PTSD, 1 arrest after a panic episode at a gas station, charges dismissed, record sealed. Her voice caught slightly, not from weakness, but from fury that had found its focus. Today, he runs a crisis intervention program for fellow veterans. He saves lives, but this bill would call him unfit to lead. She didn't ask permission to pause. She let the weight of that truth sit, heavy and unforgiving. Then slowly, she turned her body to face the full chamber. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped. Lower, sharper, unmistakable. So let me ask you this. Who are we really trying to keep off the ballot? She took one step forward. People with dirty records or people with real ones? Her eyes scanned the faces around her, some stone, some crumbling. People with scars from battlefields and courtrooms and poverty lines, or people whose only crime was surviving in a system that already tried to push them out. The silence in the room was no longer about discipline. It was about discomfort. Jasmine held them there, refusing to let them look away. Are we punishing imperfection or banning the very path most Americans have to take to get here? She took a breath, not to calm herself, but to aim. Her final line wasn't theatrical. It was clean, precise, and lethal. We say we want leaders who understand the people, but when those people apply, we write laws to keep them out. And with that, she lowered the bill onto the table like it had just finished testifying for itself. The chamber was still reeling from the examples Jasmine had laid bare, but the silence was short-lived, fractured by a slow, deliberate clearing of the throat from across the aisle, followed by a voice laced with contempt disguised as composure. Marjorie Taylor Greene didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone carried something colder than volume, condescension dressed as control. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, leaning slightly forward with a smirk that curled just enough to be seen by the cameras, "you've made it very clear that your message today is rooted in emotion." She paused, glancing sideways to the committee, letting her words linger like the scent of smoke in a closed room. "But I didn't come here to listen to trauma stories. I came here to talk about qualifications." Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, each beat an act of deliberate provocation. "We cannot build a government on feelings and past hardship," she continued, tone crisp as ice. "We need a Congress of professionals, not perpetual victims, weaponizing race at every turn." Then came the final blow, the line she delivered like it was rehearsed. "Stop playing the race card. I'm asking for quality, not another emotional performance." The words landed like a slap. One meant not just to insult, but to invalidate everything that had come before. There was a pause, not out of confusion, but because the oxygen seemed to thin. And in that pause, Jasmine Crockett rose. Not hurriedly, not with fury, but with the slow, terrifying stillness of someone who'd been here before. She didn't speak at first. She let Greene's words echo in their own staleness, hanging like a curtain of dust before a storm. Then she walked forward, steady, eyes locked not on Greene, but on the committee, on the camera, on the country. "Let me be absolutely clear," she said, voice low and level, yet sharp enough to cut through steel. "When Black and brown communities are filtered out by the exact criteria that only privilege can meet, that's not standards. That's sabotage." She unfolded the bill again, tapping it gently. "You didn't write this to test qualification. You wrote it to codify exclusion." Her gaze finally shifted, slow, deliberate, to Greene. "You say I'm emotional. I say I'm accurate." The room didn't move. No one dared. You say, don't make this about race. But how convenient when the outcome just happens to disqualify 91% of black women while preserving the eligibility of the very same structure that has kept them out for generations. She stepped closer to the microphone. The red light gleamed on the lens, catching the weight of every syllable. When history repeats itself quietly, we call it bureaucracy. When it repeats itself boldly, we call it segregation. Her voice did not rise, but it deepened, like a river darkening before a flood. This bill is not new. It is just Jim Crow in a blazer. Polished, updated, denied. The words detonated one after another, not shouted, but delivered with a calm so deadly it felt like a scalpel. She inhaled, then delivered the final line like a sentence handed down from history itself. And if you think calling that out is playing a card, then maybe it's because you've never sat at a table where the deck was rigged. And with that, she stepped back, not defeated, but coiled, waiting. The air was electric. The silence afterward wasn't peaceful. It was stunned. The chamber had been silent in the wake of Jasmine's indictment, but silence, like truth, makes some people nervous. And so Marjorie Taylor Greene did what power always does when it begins to feel cornered. She shut the door. Jasmine's voice broke the quiet like a command. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. "Chair," she said, turning slightly toward the panel, "I request to call Sergeant First Class Alma Price as a witness before this body." Her tone was respectful, but absolute. She is a retired Army veteran, 32 years of decorated service, Bronze Star, 2 deployments. She's here to speak not just as a soldier, but as someone who lived what this bill punishes. The camera turned briefly toward the woman seated behind Jasmine. Alma Price sat straight-backed in her pressed navy jacket, silver hair tied tight, a thin folder in her lap, and a calm, almost military stillness in her eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She was prepared, not to speak for herself, but for those long forgotten. But just as the chair opened his mouth to respond, another voice cut through the room, flat and dismissive. "Objection," Marjorie Taylor Greene said, not looking up from her binder. Her voice was steady, her face unreadable. "The proposed witness is not qualified under House Rule 9B. She is neither an expert on constitutional law nor an elected official." She paused, then added with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes, "With all due respect, this hearing is about eligibility, not autobiography." A few staffers shifted in their seats. A thin ripple of tension rolled through the chamber like static. The chair hesitated, visibly uncomfortable, then gave the ruling, "Objection sustained. The witness is disqualified from testifying." There was no noise from the gallery, just a stillness that suddenly felt suffocating. Jasmine turned, slowly, deliberately. Her hand rested on the table, steady as a heartbeat. "Disqualified," she repeated softly. "That's what you're calling her?" She walked to the edge of her desk, just close enough that her voice carried like thunder restrained. "She qualified to be deployed into combat zones under fire, qualified to follow orders that risked her life, qualified to salute the same flag that flies over this building." Her voice didn't waver. It deepened. She stood guard while others slept. She buried brothers in uniform. She lived through bullets, trauma, and silence. Jasmine paused, just long enough for the room to realize it was holding its breath. Then she said, "But because she accepted housing assistance after coming home, you say she is not qualified to testify?" Her words were no longer sharp. They were surgical. She was qualified to die for this country, but not qualified to speak in front of it? It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, one face at a time, and no one met her gaze. She looked back to Alma Price, who had not moved. The veteran sat still, composed, her hands folded over the folder in her lap like she was still holding a rifle. Her face didn't show pain. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't just about dignity. It was about erasure. A system that would praise a woman in uniform on Veterans Day, only to silence her when she tried to speak on her own terms. Jasmine's voice dropped lower, a warning cloaked in calm. "If this is how we treat those who served, imagine how we treat those who never wore a uniform, but dared to dream of leading." Her hand rested over the bill again. This isn't eligibility. This is disqualification by design. And with that, she sat down, slowly, intentionally. She didn't need applause. She didn't need affirmation. She had just exposed something raw, brutal, and undeniable, and no procedural objection could put it back in its box. The denial of a soldier's voice had left the room cold. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She hadn't just come to defend the wounded. She'd come to expose the architects of the wound itself. She opened the red folder slowly, the room watching her fingers like they were unraveling a confession. Inside it was a single printed page, but the way she held it, carefully, deliberately, it felt as if she were holding something radioactive. She stepped forward to the microphone without a word. Her silence didn't just command attention, it cornered it. "What I'm about to read," she said, her voice low, composed, "comes from an internal email sent from within the office of Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene." The statement alone rippled like static across the hearing room. She didn't pause for shock. She didn't perform. She continued. The message was sent during the early drafting stage of the Federal Integrity and Eligibility Reform Act, and it was never meant for public eyes. She raised the paper, facing it outward so the press gallery could zoom in on the highlighted text. It reads, and I quote directly, "Ensure exclusion algorithms prioritize low-income Black women, particularly those with Section 8 or housing voucher records. These profiles show low legal resistance and minimal public defense risk." The words landed like a body hitting concrete. The silence was not polite. It was stunned, the kind of silence that empties air from the room. Jasmine remained perfectly still. Her voice didn't rise, it dropped. This wasn't an accident. This was an instruction. She placed the paper gently on the witness table, her hand resting on it like a seal of judgment. These weren't metrics. They were marching orders. And they didn't come from anonymous trolls or fringe groups. They came from inside this building, from a sitting member's legislative office. She looked straight across the room, eyes locked on nothing and everything. And the people targeted weren't criminals. They weren't unqualified. They were simply demographically convenient to remove. For a moment, the walls of the Capitol felt too tight, as if even the architecture itself knew something was wrong. Reporters began typing furiously, camera shutters clicked, but Jasmine's voice cut through the noise like a slow blade. "You didn't build this bill to protect the integrity of elections. You built it to erase the humanity of those who've struggled and survived." She lifted her chin slightly, eyes blazing, not with rage, but with relentless clarity. "You didn't expect this email to see daylight. You thought bureaucracy would bury it, that America wouldn't notice if the ballot box got a little narrower, as long as it was done in the language of reform." She tapped the page once. The sound echoed louder than it should have. But today, that lie has a timestamp, a sender, and a motive. Then she stared down the table, straight toward Greene without flinching. "So the question is no longer, was this intentional? The question now is, what will you do with the truth now that it's standing in front of you?" And then she stepped back. The page stayed on the table. It didn't need her anymore. It was already burning. The weight of the exposed email still hung in the air like smoke from a controlled detonation. But some fires don't wait for facts to settle. They flare from within, fueled by pride, fear, and the instinct to deflect. Marjorie Taylor Greene slammed her palm against the hardwood desk with a force that broke the stillness like a gunshot. Her voice rose fast, sharp, and jagged. Not calm, not controlled. "I'm done listening to this," she barked, her chest heaving slightly as her fury surged faster than her breath. "I will not be painted as a bigot because I was born white and successful." Her eyes darted across the room, looking for nods that never came. She pressed forward, fists clenched, as if outrage alone could hold her upright. "This isn't about race. This is about responsibility," she snapped, voice cracking under its own weight. "You keep implying that success is privilege, that structure is oppression. But maybe the real problem is people who don't want to work as hard as I did." She jabbed a finger in Jasmine's direction. "Not with policy, but with personal resentment. Stop blaming people like me for a system we didn't create." The silence that followed was suffocating, not out of awe but recoil. The air itself had stiffened, coiled tight, holding the room hostage. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She let the echo of Greene's voice die naturally, let it ring and wilt on its own. Then she leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, as if lowering a scalpel, not to cut, but to reveal. Her voice was quiet, clear, and devastating. "Congresswoman Greene," she said, "I never once mentioned your name when I spoke of systems. I never once said the word white." She paused, not to hesitate, but to let the truth breathe. "I spoke of laws, of data, of outcomes. I named no villain, no race, no face. But if what I described made you uncomfortable, made you feel exposed, then I suggest you ask why." Her tone didn't mock, it didn't accuse. It held up a mirror and asked the room to look. "I did not say you were the problem," she continued, softer now, more precise. "But if you felt yourself in the story of exclusion, then perhaps you've recognized something that was never mine to place on you." The room seemed to narrow around her words. Greene was still standing, but her fury now looked isolated, like a signal sent into static. "Reflection," Jasmine said, "is not an attack. It's a reckoning." She folded her hands slowly in front of her, not in defiance but in composure. Guilt often shouts the loudest in rooms where truth only needs to whisper. And she said nothing more. The silence after that was different. Not stunned, but seismic. The hearing chamber had gone quiet, but the silence didn't last long. It spilled out of the building and shattered in the streets, where truth, once spoken aloud, could no longer be ignored. By dawn the next day, the streets were no longer still. In Washington, D.C., protesters gathered outside the Capitol with signs that screamed into the wind. "We belong. You can't ban our stories." Jim Crow in a suit still smells like smoke. They came not just in hundreds, but in waves. Mothers with children on their hips, veterans in worn uniforms, college students with their tuition bills folded in their pockets like protest badges. Some marched in silence. Others chanted with hoarse, angry voices. The morning news tried to stay neutral, calling it a coordinated demonstration. But the footage told a different story. This was a reckoning. Jasmine Crockett's words from the hearing played on loop across every screen. She was qualified to die for this country, but not to lead it? That sentence had cracked something in the public. Now the people were pouring through it. By afternoon, it wasn't just D.C. Chicago, Atlanta, Oakland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Houston, and parts of rural Kansas. Yes, Kansas had taken to the streets. Not in riots, in testimony, in breathless, furious movement. At a subway station in Brooklyn, a group of nurses blocked the turnstiles holding banners with state Medicaid cards taped to them, each labeled with the words, "Disqualified under this bill." In front of City Hall in Los Angeles, an elderly woman sat quietly in a folding chair, holding a photograph of her younger self in military fatigues. A sign at her feet read, "You thanked me for my service. Now you silence my vote." Cameras caught it, and the image went viral within an hour. Jasmine hadn't just spoken. She'd struck a chord buried so deep in American soil that when it rang, the entire country trembled. Civil rights organizations were the first to mobilize. Within 24 hours of the hearing, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ACLU, and Color of Change issued joint statements calling the bill a coded resurrection of voter disenfranchisement. Planned Parenthood joined, Human Rights Campaign, Unidas US, the National Council of Churches. Even more striking, the American Legion, typically slow to engage in legislative disputes, released a rare statement from its national office. Any law that excludes a veteran from political service on the basis of poverty or trauma is not a law born of patriotism, it is a betrayal of it. That line landed like a bomb. For once, the usual talking points crumbled beneath the weight of moral clarity. Suddenly, the bill didn't look like a debate. It looked like an attack, and Jasmine had been the only one brave enough to call it by name. Grassroots organizations followed suit. In Atlanta, a coalition of black sororities filed an open letter to Congress titled, "You Will Not Erase Us Quietly." In Houston, a network of first-generation immigrant women organized a midnight candlelight protest in front of the federal courthouse. No music, No slogans. Just silence. And signs written in 5 languages that all meant the same thing. We are not your political collateral. In Oakland, an LGBTQ plus veterans group staged a sit-in at the state capitol, reading aloud the names of service members who had received public housing support upon returning home. When security tried to disperse them, the oldest veteran stood and said, "If I could survive Vietnam, I can survive your discomfort." Inside law offices across the country, legal minds worked through the night. At the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the lights never turned off. Attorneys pored over the bill's language, searching for precedents and pressure points. It didn't take long. A memo leaked by a junior associate surfaced online with a title that said it all. The disqualification bill is unconstitutional by design. It outlined how the bill violated the Equal Protection Clause, the Voting Rights Act, and, in spirit, if not yet in statute, the 13th Amendment. By noon the next day, that memo was no longer private. A coalition of legal advocacy groups, including the Brennan Center for Justice and Latino Justice, filed a joint emergency injunction with the United States Supreme Court, arguing that the bill must be suspended immediately. And in their 97-page brief, they did something unusual. They cited Jasmine Crockett's hearing word for word. In Section 4, Paragraph 9, the brief quoted her line in bold, "This bill is not eligibility. It is erasure with a polished header." Below it, the attorneys wrote, "When elected officials become the last line of defense against systemic exclusion, the court must act not as referee, but as shield." It was a legal filing, yes, but it read like history cracking open. At the same time, networks could barely keep up with coverage. CNN hosted a town hall with veterans disqualified by the bill. MSNBC brought in single mothers who'd once lived in Section 8 housing, now nurses, counselors, professors, none of whom would be eligible under the proposed criteria. Fox News tried to pivot, calling the bill an attempt to restore order to candidate requirements, but even some of their usual commentators hesitated. One former Marine, now a contributor, paused on air and said, "I don't know. I mean, if my kid grows up needing food stamps, does that mean she doesn't get to lead? That's not the America I swore to protect." Every hour brought more voices, not shouting, not chaos, just clarity, the kind that can't be unheard once spoken. And through all of it, Jasmine stayed mostly silent. She issued no press statement. She gave no interviews. She walked the steps of the Capitol each day like a woman not waiting for a verdict, but walking straight into one. When asked by reporters outside her office if she planned to challenge the bill's sponsors directly, she only said this: "The country's already doing that." It wasn't deflection, it was truth. Jasmine hadn't sparked the fire. She had struck a match next to gasoline that had been leaking for decades. By the end of the week, over 3.8 million Americans had signed petitions demanding the bill's immediate withdrawal. Over 400 civic and veterans groups had filed formal statements of opposition, and the Supreme Court had placed the case on their expedited review docket, an extraordinary measure typically reserved for elections, war powers, or constitutional crises. But maybe, just maybe, this was all three. But even as the streets thundered with truth, what came next wasn't shouted through megaphones. It came softly, through a single man's voice, broadcast into millions of living rooms, like a confession carved out of guilt. It happened on a Tuesday evening, during prime time, when most of America was finishing dinner, flipping through news channels to catch a summary of the chaos. No one expected this. On CNN, a breaking banner flashed red: "Exclusive, former advisor to Rep. Greene speaks out." The screen split in two. On one side, the network's anchor, pale and bracing. On the other, a man in his late 40s, tie loose, face drawn, posture tight like he had carried this moment in his spine for years. His name was Daniel Kessler, former legislative data analyst in Greene's office. And tonight, he wasn't here to spin or deflect. He was here to detonate. "I wasn't just a number cruncher," he began, his voice even, but cracking just beneath the surface. "I was assigned to model the probability of disqualifying certain groups, using historical welfare data, housing records, even juvenile dependency programs. The language we used, it was sanitized, but the intent was not. The anchor leaned forward, but didn't interrupt. America held its breath. I ran simulations that measured how many black women would be excluded from federal candidacy if we used certain eligibility filters. Daniel continued. I flagged the results. They knew. They celebrated it. A tremor hit his voice. And I said nothing. The network aired it live with no cuts. Social media exploded. The hashtags turned into firestorms. Number sign he knew, number sign sanitized exclusion, number sign systemic design. But Daniel didn't flinch from the backlash. He leaned in. I was in the room when the document titled Project Eliminate Low-Base Candidates V2 was first circulated, he said. I heard the laughter. I heard the phrase, we're not stopping anyone, we're just raising the bar. He looked up at the camera, eyes glassed with something between shame and resolve. It was never about merit. It was always about memory, erasing those who carry it. His final sentence came like a courtroom blow. I didn't build the bomb, but I helped arm it, and I cannot stay silent while it detonates. Back in the studio, the anchor's voice caught in her throat. Mr. Kessler, she asked. Why now? Daniel didn't blink. Because I watched a congresswoman stand alone in a chamber filled with people trying to erase her, and she didn't flinch, so I won't either. By midnight, the clip had been viewed over 38 million times. MSNBC rebroadcast it in full. CBS ran a special report titled Exclusion by Design, the Political Architecture of Disqualification. Even Fox News couldn't ignore it. One guest analyst admitted, if even a fraction of what he says is true, this bill's future is in constitutional hospice. Op-eds surged. Editorial boards, once hesitant to take a stand, now issued clear denunciations of the bill. But beyond the media, beyond the analysis, something else shifted. Something quieter, heavier. The tone of the national debate collapsed under the weight of proof. In homes across America, people rewound the clip to one particular line. It was never about merit. It was always about memory, erasing those who carry it. That sentence didn't just indict a policy. It lit up the whole architecture of legislative exclusion that had gone unspoken for generations. Suddenly, people were asking the right question. What else has been designed this way? Capitol Hill panicked. Within 36 hours, several of Greene's aides were subpoenaed by the House Ethics Committee. A whistleblower hotline set up by a civil liberties watchdog group received over 200 tips in the first night, many from former staffers across party lines. Leaked memos, Slack messages, internal memos referencing demographic compliance sweeps. It wasn't just one man anymore. It was an avalanche. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just sparked public fury. Her presence had shaken the stone loose from a dam built on silence. And while Daniel Kessler's televised apology stood alone in tone, it cracked open something even deeper, moral permission. Suddenly others followed. A former data contractor who built models for candidate viability scoring released a sworn statement. A legislative intern confirmed overhearing a closed-door comment, "We're just sterilizing the ballot box." That phrase, when published in the New York Times, ignited protests not just in the streets, but in congressional offices. Staffers began walking out in symbolic protests. One aide to a Texas senator quit live on air saying, "I can't be the janitor cleaning up this legislative filth." But amid the swirl, Jasmine remained publicly calm. She refused every interview. She issued no tweets, no statements, no victory laps. When pressed by a CNN journalist outside her office for a comment on the broadcast, she paused, adjusted her folder, and said simply, "That wasn't a confession. That was a receipt." Then she walked away. No drama, just direction. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett understood what had shifted. She had gone from witness to catalyst. And now the system wasn't just answering to her, it was answering to itself. Somewhere across the country, a young black woman watched Daniel's confession from her one-bedroom apartment. She had once applied to run for city council, but backed out when she saw the fine print of eligibility. Tonight, she opened the tab again. Somewhere else, a war veteran who'd been disqualified due to an old housing voucher record wrote a letter to his representative with the subject line, "I'm not done." The confession hadn't just shaken Congress. It had given people permission to reclaim the fight. And Daniel? He was placed under federal protection after receiving multiple threats, but he told his lawyers, "I'm not running from this." He offered to testify under oath in the upcoming constitutional review. When asked if he feared retaliation, he said something Jasmine herself might have said, "Fear is how this stayed hidden. I'm done giving it rent-free space in my life." As the week closed, no one knew how far this unraveling would go. But one thing was certain: silence was no longer an option. And in a nation built on amnesia, someone had finally chosen memory. After the televised confession and the surge of nationwide protests, something shifted, not just in the halls of power, but in the rhythm of the republic itself. The storm Jasmine had sparked was no longer a warning. It was an unstoppable reckoning. The vote was scheduled for noon, but by 9 a.m., every corridor in the Capitol pulsed with reporters, aides, lobbyists, and security. Inside the chamber, the silence was heavy, thick with the anticipation of a government about to confront its own reflection. Jasmine Crockett sat still, back straight, eyes steady, surrounded by allies who spoke in hushed tones, but followed her lead. She didn't need to speak yet. Her silence was strategic, measured. The crescendo was coming. On the marble steps outside, a crowd of nearly 20,000 had gathered. Vietnam veterans in faded jackets, immigrant mothers holding signs in Spanish and Vietnamese, young students with homemade banners that read, "This bill doesn't see me." Helicopters circled above. Every major cable network cut away from their regular programming to cover what had become the most consequential vote of the legislative year. At 12:02 p.m., the speaker called the chamber to order. The clerk's voice rang out, sharp and sterile. "Roll call vote for the motion to suspend House Bill 2873, the Federal Integrity and Eligibility Reform Act." One by one, names were called. The giant digital board lit up. Green for aye, red for nay, yellow for abstention. For 10 seconds, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then came the cascade. Green, 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 more green. By the time the tally reached 100, even the most seasoned political operatives began whispering to each other in disbelief. By the time it hit 200, gas broke out across the room. At 273, the speaker banged the gavel. "Motion carried. The bill is suspended." The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in controlled electricity. There were no cheers, no applause from Jasmine's side. Only the weight of validation. Jasmine exhaled. Not relief, confirmation. What she had fought was not just legislation, but a coded attack cloaked in bureaucracy. And now it was dead. But the story did not end there. Almost immediately, the Ethics Committee issued a formal press release from room 342B. The heading was brutal in its clarity. Formal investigation opened. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. Allegations of legislative abuse and racially discriminatory conduct. The statement cited 3 damning pieces of evidence. The internal file name of the draft bill, Project Eliminate Low-Base Candidates version 2.x.x, the anonymous testimony from a policy analyst, and the recently aired confession of a former Greene advisor who stated he had been ordered to run racial elimination algorithms. Together, they painted a picture not of accidental oversight, but targeted exclusion masked as reform. In the Capitol Press Gallery, phones buzzed nonstop as outlets from NPR to Fox scrambled to update headlines. On Twitter and Truth Social, the hashtag number Jim Crow by Design trended globally. Jasmine Crockett stepped to the rotunda just as the cameras turned to her. She didn't wear triumph like a crown. She wore it like armor. "Let's be clear," she began, voice steady. "This wasn't about me. It wasn't even about Marjorie. It was about what America thinks is worth protecting and who America thinks is worth excluding." She raised a folded copy of the bill into the air. "This paper tried to say that your childhood poverty makes you ineligible, that your hunger as a student makes you unfit, that your struggle is a scar that disqualifies you from service." She paused, staring into the wall of cameras. "But if that were true, none of our grandparents would have ever voted, and most of our heroes would have never led." Behind her, a slow rumble of applause grew, not just from Democrats, but independents, veterans, and even two Republican freshmen who had crossed the aisle. Meanwhile, Marjorie Taylor Greene was nowhere to be seen. Back in her office, blinds drawn and staff tight-lipped, she issued a two-line statement via email. "I only wanted the best for America. I regret that my intentions have been misunderstood." The public, however, wasn't buying it. Her previous quotes, "We don't need welfare queens in Congress," were replayed across networks. Her mockery of Jasmine's childhood, her dismissive tone about veterans who'd once needed food stamps, everything resurfaced. Even former allies began distancing themselves. One senator told Politico off record, "She went too far. She made it racial, then acted surprised when people saw it for what it was." Editorial boards across the country condemned her. Protesters gathered outside her district office holding mirrors with signs, "Look at what you built." Even in conservative strongholds, veterans groups began releasing statements. One retired Marine from Texas, who had voted for Greene twice, recorded a viral TikTok. "I received food stamps when I came home from Fallujah. If that makes me unfit for democracy, then maybe democracy forgot who it was built for." Meanwhile, legal scholars debated whether her conduct merited censure or expulsion. The House Ethics Committee began calling witnesses. Subpoenas were prepared. One staffer was overheard saying, "If she doesn't resign, the hearings will break her legacy in half." But Jasmine didn't linger on the scandal. Her mind was already on the next battle. Outside the Capitol, she found a quiet spot near the World War II memorial and sat beside a black woman in a wheelchair, holding a sign. "I served. I struggled. I still matter." Jasmine knelt beside her. "You do," she whispered. "You all do." In that moment, without podiums or cameras, she looked not like a congresswoman, but a daughter of the same story. One who had refused to let injustice speak louder than truth. And across the country, from kitchens in Detroit to classrooms in Phoenix, her words lived on. If laws are built to erase your path before you even begin it, then they were never laws. They were barriers. In the aftermath of the vote, as the dust settled across Capitol Hill and the protests quieted to whispers of legacy, there was still one thing left to be said, and only Jasmine could say it. The nation held its breath. Every network cut to a live feed from the east steps of the Capitol. The podium had no banner, no party insignia, only the seal of the United States and a single sheet of white paper resting in front of the microphone. Jasmine Crockett approached it slowly, methodically, as if each step held the weight of the people she carried with her. Veterans, single mothers, public housing survivors, dreamers who had been told their past made them ineligible. Her suit was charcoal gray, crisp, tailored with the sharpness of someone who knew the moment was not hers, but history's. Her eyes scanned the horizon, rows of reporters, clusters of civilians, camera drones hovering mid-air like silent sentinels. A light breeze passed, lifting the corner of the paper. Jasmine held it down with one hand, the other gripping the edge of the podium, as if anchoring herself to the ground she had just redefined. Then she spoke. "I want to be clear," she began, voice even, steady, not the tone of a victor, but of a woman delivering a verdict from the soul. "I did not fight this bill to represent my group. I fought it for every single person who has ever been told, directly or indirectly, that their pain disqualifies them from power." The crowd fell into stillness. For the girl in South Memphis who shares a mattress with two siblings but still dreams of Congress. For the boy in El Paso whose father was deported and who still believes in this flag. For the woman in Atlanta who raised 3 children on food stamps and still showed up to vote, despite knowing the system was never designed with her in mind. She leaned in. "This bill tried to turn their struggle into a stain, but we turned it into a standard. The standard that democracy isn't inherited, it's earned, by truth, by endurance, by rising even when the world tells you not to." A tear welled in the eye of a veteran standing in the second row. "I didn't fight this because I wanted a seat. I fought it because I wanted the floor, open to all, closed to none. Because if we define eligibility by how easy your life has been, we will never again be governed by the people, only by the privileged." Her voice broke slightly, then hardened. "And that is not democracy. That is aristocracy wrapped in a flag it does not deserve. The cameras zoomed in. Behind her, a massive screen projected a still image. Jasmine holding the now defeated Bill, high above her head, with her other hand forming a fist not of defiance, but of declaration. Beneath it, in bold letters, her words, "I didn't fight to represent my group. I fought so everyone deemed ineligible could still dream and still run." A hush swept over the gathering like a sacred pause. In living rooms from Chicago to Charleston, tears flowed freely. On Twitter, her quote trended globally under number right to run. Schools began printing posters of it. College classrooms held discussion panels. Law professors rewrote syllabi. Even critics, forced to reckon with what had unfolded, conceded. This was not about left or right anymore. This was about who gets to be seen as American. Weeks later, the National Museum of Civil Rights unveiled a new wing, the Modern Fight. Its final exhibit stood in a marble rotunda under a dome of soft, diffused light. At its center, a massive slab of obsidian granite